My son handed me a manila envelope on the Sunday afternoon, right there at my own kitchen table, while my wife was in the other room watching the news. He set it down like it was a utility bill. Casual. Like it was nothing. I remember looking at it, then looking at him, and he just nodded toward it like, "Go ahead, open it." I opened it. Inside were 37 pages of financial documents. A loan agreement, a promissory note, and a cover letter, typed, formatted, with my name at the top, informing me that I was now the primary financial guarantor of a $380,000 business debt that my son and his wife had accumulated over the previous 2 years running a catering company that I had never once been consulted about. I sat there for a moment. Just sat there. Then I said, "What is this?" And my son looked at me with this expression I hadn't seen since he was 15, and trying to explain why he'd wrecked my car, somewhere between confidence and desperation, and he said, "Dad, you have the money. You've always had the money. We need you to do this for the family." I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county. I drove a used Camry for 11 of those years because I was putting money away. My wife and I never took a vacation that cost more than $2,000 until I retired, and even then, we planned it for 8 months in advance because that's just how we were raised. We were savers, we were careful, we were responsible. And my son was sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon asking me to sign over access to my retirement account to cover the wreckage of a business I didn't even know was failing. I need to back up because this didn't come out of nowhere. Or maybe it did, and I just wasn't paying attention. That's the thing about being a parent. You spend so much time hoping for the best that sometimes you stop seeing what's actually in front of you. My son is 38, he's sharp, genuinely smart, always was, did well in school, went to state, got a business degree. His wife is the same way, driven, ambitious, always with a plan. When they told us 4 years ago that they were going to open a catering company, I thought it was a solid idea. They both knew food, they had energy, the local market seemed right for it. My wife and I gave them $15,000 as a gift to help them get started. We told them it was a gift, not a loan, a gift. Because that's what parents do when they can, and we could. What I didn't know, what they never told me, was that the business had been bleeding money since the second year. The commercial kitchen lease alone was running them $6,200 a month. They'd taken out an SBA loan, then a second line of credit, then a personal loan against their house. And somewhere in all of that, I guess they decided that the natural next step was me. What they did not do was ask. And that's the part that still gets me when I think about it. Not the money, the not asking. The sitting down and drawing up legal documents and printing them out and putting them in an envelope and driving to my house on a Sunday and treating it like a formality, like I was a bank that had already approved the loan and just needed to sign the paperwork. I told my son I needed time to look this over. He nodded like that was reasonable. His wife, who had been waiting in the living room, I hadn't even realized she'd come with him, appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "We really are in a tough spot, Dad. We're counting on you." She called me Dad. She's called me that for 12 years. It's always felt warm before. That day it felt like a hand reaching into my pocket. They left. My wife came into the kitchen. She'd heard enough. She sat down across from me, looked at the documents spread out on the table and said, "We're not signing that." I said, "I know." She said, "Call Dennis tomorrow." Dennis is my attorney. I've used him for estate planning, the house refinance back in 2019, a property dispute with a neighbor that turned out to be nothing. He's practical, doesn't waste words. Charges fair rates for our area. I called him the next morning and faxed over the documents. He called me back within an hour. The first thing he said was, "Did you know your signature is already on page 22? I said I was sorry. "What?" He said it again, slower. Page 22 of the loan agreement, the personal guarantor section, had my signature on it. My full name, signed in blue ink, dated 14 months earlier. I had never seen page 22. I had never signed anything. I had never agreed to be anyone's guarantor. I didn't even know the loan existed 14 months ago. I remember the room going very quiet. Dennis said he was going to need the original envelope and everything that came in it. He said not to contact my son until we spoke again. He said very carefully, "This is serious." I don't know how to explain what the next 72 hours felt like. My wife and I didn't sleep much. We sat in the kitchen a lot drinking coffee that went cold, going over and over the same questions. When did he do this? How? Did he practice my signature? Did he have something with my signature on it that he copied? A birthday card? A check? I sign checks the old-fashioned way. I actually write them out because I'm 64 and that's what I do. We did not call our son. We did what Dennis told us to do. Dennis sent the signature to a forensic document examiner he works with. The examiner's report came back in 10 days. The conclusion was unambiguous. The signature was a skilled imitation, not my authentic signature. There were measurable inconsistencies in pen pressure, letter formation, and baseline angle that could be demonstrated and documented. My son had forged my signature on a federal loan document. That's a crime. That is a federal crime. And it was my son who did it. I'm not going to pretend I was calm. I sat in my truck in the driveway for about 40 minutes after Dennis called me with those results. I didn't cry, but it was close. It wasn't even anger, not right then. It was something more like grief, like something you loved had died, and you hadn't been there when it happened, and you couldn't even pinpoint the moment it went wrong. My son called 3 times over those 10 days. I let them go to voicemail. My wife did the same. The messages were normal at first. "Hey, Dad, just checking in, call me back." By the third one, his voice had a different quality to it. Tighter. Like he was working to keep it even. Dennis advised me that I had 2 options. I could pursue criminal charges, which given the federal nature of the document was potentially a serious matter, or I could confront the situation civilly. Give my son the chance to come clean, retract the documents, and formally release me from any liability, with the understanding that if he refused, we would pursue all available legal remedies. My wife and I talked about it for a long time. We went back and forth. A part of me wanted to just call the FBI and be done with it. Another part of me, the part that remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway of our first house, the part that drove 4 hours each way to watch him walk across a stage to get his diploma, that part wanted to give him one chance to be the person I raised him to be. We chose the second option, with conditions. Dennis sent a certified letter to my son's home address. It outlined in plain terms what we had discovered, what the forensic examination had concluded, and what we were requiring: a signed retraction of all documents, a written statement acknowledging that I had never agreed to serve as guarantor, and a complete release of any claim against my retirement accounts or any other assets. The letter also made clear that if these conditions were not met within 14 days, we would pursue all available legal and criminal remedies without further notice. My son called me 20 minutes after the certified mail was delivered. I know the timing because I was watching a baseball game and my phone rang and I looked at the screen and thought, here we go. He did not lead with an apology. He said, "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the documents." I said, "Is that right?" He said they had used an electronic signature service and that maybe there was some kind of error, some kind of technical mix-up, and that he was sure we could work this out without involving lawyers. I said, "Dennis is already involved." Long pause. He said, "Look, we are really struggling here. We are about to lose everything. The business is gone. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage on our house, and we have nobody else. You're my father. You have more than enough. Why won't you just help us?" And there it was, that sentence. You have more than enough. Why won't you just help us? I want to be honest here because I think a lot of people have been in a version of this conversation and they know how hard it is. Part of me felt the pull. Of course it did. That's your kid. That's your child. No matter how old they are. No matter what they've done. And hearing the fear in his voice. Because there was real fear under there, I could hear it. That lands somewhere in your chest, and it doesn't feel good. But he had forged my signature on a legal document. He had not asked me for help. He had not sat down and said, "Dad, we're in trouble. Is there anything you can do?" He had printed up 37 pages of manufactured obligation and put them in an envelope and driven to my house and set them on my kitchen table like he had the right to make that decision for me. There is a difference between a son who comes to his father in need and a son who comes to his father with documents. I said, "Sign the retraction. Everything else is between you and your attorney." He said, "You're really going to do this?" I said, "You did this." He hung up. 3 days later, his wife called my wife. I don't know everything that was said on that call, but my wife came to find me in the garage afterward, and her face told me enough. Apparently, my daughter-in-law had suggested that if we forced this issue, the family would be irreparably damaged and that it would be on us. My wife is a patient woman. She has more grace than I do in most situations. But she told my daughter-in-law that the family had already been damaged by the people who forged the signature, and then she ended the call. I was proud of her. The 14-day window passed. My son did not sign the retraction. He did not respond at all through his attorney. He didn't have one as far as we could tell. And the only contact was that one phone call and the call to my wife. Dennis filed. Now, I want to take a moment here because I know some people wonder about how this kind of thing actually works in court. A lot of folks assume that if someone forges your name on a document, it's your word against theirs. That's not really how it works when you have a forensic document examiner's report. What we had was a professional, written, documented analysis comparing the question signature to known authentic samples of my handwriting with specific, measurable findings. That's not nothing, that's a lot. We also had the envelope with the postmark, the fact that I had no prior knowledge of the loan, and the fact that my son had never, not once, in any of his phone calls or his wife's call, actually denied forging the signature. He'd said misunderstanding, he'd said technical mix-up. He had never said I didn't do this. Because he couldn't. He knew we had the examiner's report. The hearing was on a Thursday morning. I wore the same suit I wore to my retirement dinner, dark blue. My wife picked it out. I've worn it maybe 4 times in my life because I am not a suit person, and I am at peace with that. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the smell of old carpet and coffee. My son was there with his wife. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him. He was wearing a tie that I recognized. It was one I'd given him for Christmas, years ago, one of those impulse gifts because I saw it and thought he'd like it. He did like it, or he said he did. Seeing it across that courtroom was one of the stranger moments of my life. He had an attorney with him. She was young, looked like she might have been 2 years out of law school, and she kept leaning over and whispering to my son, who kept nodding like he understood more than he did. The judge was a compact man in his mid-50s, with reading glasses that he wore on the tip of his nose and a habit of looking over them at whoever was speaking. He had the manner of someone who had heard every possible variation of every possible family dispute and was not especially surprised by any of it. Dennis presented our case methodically. The documents, the forensic analysis, the timeline establishing that I had no knowledge of or involvement in the loan, the lack of any prior agreement, verbal or written, to serve as a financial guarantor for my son's business. My son's attorney argued that the signature dispute was a matter of interpretation and that regardless of how it came to be, I had a moral and familial obligation to support my son in a time of financial need. The judge looked over his glasses at her for a moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "Sir, at any point did you agree, verbally, in writing, or in any other form, to serve as the financial guarantor for your son's business loan?" I said, "No, Your Honor, I did not." He nodded. He wrote something down. Then he looked at my son's attorney and said, "The emotional and familial dimensions of this situation are not within the jurisdiction of this court. A parent has no legal obligation to assume financial liability for an adult child's business debts, particularly absent any documented agreement to do so. And particularly," he paused, and I don't think I imagined the weight in that pause, "when the documentation that exists appears to have been created without the alleged guarantor's knowledge or consent." He ruled in our favor. Complete and total, the forged documents were declared void and unenforceable. My son and his attorney were ordered to pay our legal fees. There was also a notation in the ruling, Dennis explained this to me afterward, that referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal charges related to document fraud. Whether that process goes anywhere, I honestly don't know. I don't control it. I didn't ask for it specifically. It was the judge's call. My son looked at the table when the ruling was read. His wife covered her face with her hand. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes people expect you to feel triumphant when you win something like this. Mostly, I just felt tired and very, very sad. Dennis shook my hand outside the courthouse. My wife, who had been sitting in the third row behind me the whole time, came and took my arm, and we walked to the parking garage together without saying very much. We have not spoken to our son since that morning. He has not called. We have not called. My wife gets a text from our daughter-in-law every few weeks. They vary between guilt and anger, sometimes in the same message, and my wife reads them and doesn't respond. I think that's the right call. I don't know what there is to say. People ask me if I would have helped them. If he had just come to me, not with documents, not with a manufactured obligation, but just sat down like a human being and said, "Dad, we are in serious trouble. Is there anything you can do?" Would I have helped? Probably. Not $380,000. I'm not a bottomless well and my retirement isn't a rescue fund. But something real, something thought out. Because that's what parents do, when they can. And when they're asked, and when the person asking treats them like a person. He didn't do that. He made a choice about my money and my future and my signature, and he made it without me. And then when I found out, his first instinct wasn't to apologize. It was to explain it away, and then to make me feel like I was the one doing something wrong. I can't fix that. I don't know if he can. What I can tell you is this. My wife and I spent the following spring driving the Pacific Coast Highway from Oregon all the way down to San Diego. We stayed in a lodge in Cannon Beach for 3 nights and watched storms roll in off the ocean from a window seat. We ate fresh Dungeness crab at a place in Astoria with 15 tables and a 45-minute wait. We drove through the redwoods in Northern California, and I pulled the car over on the side of the road for no reason except that the light through those trees was something I'd never seen before, and I didn't want to just drive past it. We were not in a hurry. We had nowhere we had to be. I'm 64 years old. I worked for 31 years and I was careful and I was responsible and I saved what I saved and I will spend it the way I choose with the person who has stood next to me through every hard thing this life has handed us. That money is ours. It was always ours. And not a single person on this earth has the right to tell me otherwise. I still think about that Sunday afternoon, the envelope on the kitchen table, the way my son nodded toward it like it was nothing. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. On that drive down the coast, watching the ocean, eating crab in a little place in Astoria with my wife across from me, and what I keep coming back to is this. The outcome of our story wasn't decided in that courtroom. It was decided years before, and the small choices my son made and the small choices I made, stacking up one on top of another until the weight of them finally became impossible to ignore. My son is a smart man. I've always known that. But intelligence without honesty is just a sharper tool for making worse mistakes. He looked at my retirement account, money I had spent 31 years earning carefully, quietly, without complaint, and he decided that his need outweighed my right to choose. That's not a financial error. That's a moral one. And moral errors have a way of compounding, just like interest. You make one, and then you need a bigger one to cover it, and then a bigger one still. Until one day you're sitting in a courtroom in a tie your father gave you for Christmas, hoping the judge doesn't look too closely at page 22. What I didn't see clearly until later is that the hardest thing about all of this wasn't the forgery. It was the fact that my son had stopped thinking clearly somewhere along the way, stopped seeing the difference between a desperate situation and a justification for crossing a line that can't be uncrossed. When the business started failing, the right move was to sit down, face the numbers honestly, and ask for help like a grown man. Instead, he manufactured an obligation and called it family. There's a word for that kind of thinking, and it isn't cleverness. It's the moment a person stops being their own author and starts making excuses for whoever they've become. I don't say any of this with satisfaction. I say it because I have lived long enough to know that the people who come through hard things intact are the ones who face what's actually in front of them, not the version of it that's easier to survive, not the version that lets them stay comfortable, but the real thing, the honest thing. That takes something. It takes the willingness to stand in your own kitchen and say, I made a mess of this, and I need help. Not documents, not leverage, just the plain truth of where you are. My wife and I are fine. Better than fine most days. We pulled over in the redwoods on that drive south because the light coming through those trees was something I didn't want to miss. I'm 64 years old, and I've learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that most of the things worth having in this life aren't things you can take from someone. They're things you build together over time with people who trust you. That trust, once you've spent it, doesn't come back on demand. I hope my son figures that out. I genuinely do. Not because I want anything from him, but because I remember who he was before all of this, and that person was worth knowing. The money was never the point. It never is.